I had been up since dawn, hands busy with ribbon and paper, wrapping the only thing I thought worthy to bring to Clarice's Christmas dinner. It was an antique wine opener from my late husband's collection, polished until the brass gleamed. He used to say it carried the weight of every celebration we'd ever hosted. I imagined placing it on the table, a small reminder that I still had something of value to offer. The phone rang just as I folded the last corner. Clarice's name lit up the screen. My chest lifted for a moment. I thought perhaps she was calling to ask if I needed a ride, or to remind me of the seating plan. Instead, her voice landed sharp, like ice cracking on a winter pond. "Mother, you're not ready to sit with us this year," she said. "We have senators, CEOs, people who expect refinement. You'll understand." I couldn't speak. My throat closed. From somewhere behind her voice came a man's chuckle. "My son-in-laws. Don't let her embarrass us again," he muttered, not bothering to lower his tone. Clarice continued without pause. "And don't bring anything. People will notice. Cheap things." I looked down at the package resting in my lap. The ribbon was crooked now. My hand had started to shake. For a moment, I considered defending myself, telling her about the years her father and I had used that wine opener to open bottles for Christmas toasts, about how it wasn't cheap at all. It was history, memory, family. But her silence on the line told me there was no space for my words. "I see," I managed, the words tasting like ash. She ended the call quickly, efficient as ever, leaving me alone in the quiet hum of the house. The decorated box felt suddenly heavy, absurd. I carried it to the mantel and set it beside the faded photograph of my husband, his smile warm, his hand resting on my shoulder, the room pressed in around me. For 70 years I had endured storms with patience, telling myself love would outlast pride. But as I stared at the gift I would not give, I realized this was not about readiness. It was about being erased. The television remote sat on the table. The only sound in the house, my own uneven breathing. I reached for it, needing distraction from the silence that had followed me into every corner. Christmas Eve crept in colder than I remembered. Outside my window, the roses I had coaxed through autumn still bloomed against the frost, fragile petals stubbornly refusing to wither. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of lukewarm tea, staring at the chair across from me, the chair that should have held laughter, the clink of a glass, the warmth of family. It sat empty, and so did I. The silence pressed heavy. I reached for the remote, flicking on the television just to fill the air. Bright colors, jingles, and holiday greetings washed over me, each one a reminder of where I was not. Then the program cut sharply. The anchor's voice urgent. "Breaking news. Louisville-based Green Haven Solutions has secured a $220 million federal contract for affordable eco-homes. The founder, Evelina Mercer, signed the agreement earlier this week." For a second, I thought I had misheard, but then there it was, my name printed across the screen in bold letters, my face appearing in grainy footage from the signing ceremony. I watched myself shake hands with officials, the cameras flashing. Industry experts are calling Mercer a pioneer in sustainable design. The anchor continued. Her company's innovative housing model is expected to reshape urban development across the Midwest. My hands trembled so badly I nearly spilled the tea. I hadn't told anyone about the contract, not even my neighbors. I had learned long ago that keeping quiet was safer than inviting ridicule. But now the city knew. While Clarice poured champagne into crystal flutes and boasted of her guest list, strangers toasted to my vision. I turned the volume down, afraid the sound would break the spell. On the screen, they replayed a clip of me holding the signed contract, my smile steady, though my heart had pounded that day. Reporters described me as resilient, innovative, words I had never once heard from my own child. I looked back at the empty chair, then at the roses outside, petals glowing faintly against the winter light. My throat tightened as I whispered into the stillness. You told me I wasn't ready. The world thinks otherwise. I left the TV on, the soft hum of my name carrying through the house, as memories of how much I had given and how much had been dismissed rose uninvited to the surface. When my husband died at 43, the world shrank around me. Bills piled where love letters once lay, and every corner of the house seemed to echo with absence. Clarice was still a child then, her hair in ribbons, her voice always asking for more dresses, more toys, more of what I couldn't afford. I gave what I could, but behind every shift at the school where I scrubbed chalk dust from desks, I carried something else, a notebook filled with sketches. Eco-housing, I called it in my mind. Homes that could breathe with the earth instead of choking it. While I stitched hems at midnight or polished cafeteria floors before dawn, I drew frames, calculated angles, scribbled wild ideas no one cared to hear. Clarice grew older and sharper. She hated my plain blouses, the second-hand car that coughed smoke when I drove her to school. One afternoon, as I tried to fix a broken latch on the door, she tossed her hair and said with a sneer, "You'll never be more than a fixer of broken things." I swallowed her words like grit. At Sunday dinners with my in-laws, it was no different. They laughed at my hands, rough from work, and whispered loud enough for me to hear that I had dragged their son into mediocrity. I smiled faintly, said little, and went home to my notebooks. Every insult added another line, another detail, another reason to keep drawing. The only voice that ever softened the blows was Harold Winslow, my husband's brother, a retired architect. His eyes saw what others refused. "You've got something here," he told me once, running his fingers over my sketches. Years later, after his passing, the lawyer placed a sealed envelope in my hands. Inside was a check for $15,000 and a note for the house you'll one day build. I invested it quietly, never telling a soul. Even as Clarice reached for shinier things, I watered that seed, believing that one day it would grow roots deep enough to outlast all their laughter. The check from Harold sat in my drawer for months before I gathered the courage to use it. I took one of my most polished blueprints, an eco-housing design meant for low-cost neighborhoods, and brought it to a modest construction firm on the edge of town. The owner studied it with skeptical eyes, but agreed to license it for what most people would call pennies. When word reached my in-laws, they laughed openly. "You sold your dreams for scraps," one of them said across the dinner table. Even Clarice rolled her eyes, as though my work were nothing more than a hobby stitched between my janitor shifts. What they never knew was that those scraps began to grow. That small firm found unexpected success using my design, and with every new contract they signed, a quiet trickle of royalties arrived in my mailbox. I said nothing. I deposited every check, and little by little, a foundation formed beneath my feet. Years later, when the trickle turned steady, I registered a name that had lived in my notebooks for decades: Greenhaven. I rented space in a repurposed warehouse, its brick walls still smelling of machine oil, and hired a handful of engineers, most of them barely older than my granddaughter would have been. They didn't see me as an aging widow clinging to old notebooks. They listened, eyes bright, calling me visionary, asking questions with genuine hunger. I never told Clarice. By then, she was flashing photographs of Paris vacations, boasting about champagne flights and silk scarves. She wouldn't have believed me, and I was too tired of proving myself, So while she filled her shelves with souvenirs, I was signing non-disclosure agreements with city councils, shaping plans that could alter entire neighborhoods. I watched her world sparkle while mine stayed in shadow, and I preferred it that way. Some truths are stronger when hidden, and silence became the soil where my work could finally take root. But silence also meant she never knew how far I'd come, and it left room for wounds that were still waiting to reopen. Not all the wounds my daughter gave me came through words. Some were carved in ink. It was nearly a decade ago when I opened a letter from the bank and felt my stomach drop. My house, the only place I had left of my husband, had been listed as collateral on a private loan. The signature wasn't mine. Clarice had taken my deed papers, certain I wouldn't notice until it was too late. I went to her, papers trembling in my hand. "Clarice, why would you do this?" My voice was steady, though my heart was pounding. She didn't flinch. "You weren't using it properly," she said, as though I were an old woman wasting space. "I fixed it. You'll be fine." Her tone had the same chill I heard in her call this Christmas. A dismissal. An erasure. I didn't argue. I didn't call the police. I sold off a portion of my royalties, paid the loan myself, and tucked the deed back into the drawer where it belonged. No one ever knew. And I told myself it was better that way. Easier than carrying a public scandal with my daughter's name stamped across it. But tonight, with the television repeating my name and strangers calling me a pioneer, that memory rose like smoke. My hands clenched at the thought of how easily she had taken the roof from over me once. I looked at the roses in the frost, the petals still refusing to fall. "You took my roof once," I whispered into the quiet, "but you won't take my legacy." The phone began to buzz on the table, messages piling faster than I could read. And I knew it was only the beginning. The morning after the headlines broke, I drove to my office on the industrial side of Louisville. The converted warehouse still smelled faintly of machine oil, its brick walls scarred with age. But it had become the heart of Green Haven. I parked my old sedan beside a row of newer cars and walked inside, my breath visible in the cold air. The receptionist looked up from her desk, eyes wide. "Mrs. Mercer, your daughter's here." My chest tightened. I followed her gaze toward the lobby, and there she was. Clarice sat with one leg crossed elegantly over the other, a silk blazer catching the light, her smile radiant enough to fool anyone who didn't know her. "Mother," she exclaimed, rising quickly as though we'd never been apart. "I'm so proud of you. Everyone at dinner last night talked about you senators, CEOs, they all know your name now. Imagine what we could do if I connected you with my husband's investors." I let her words hang in the air, my face still as stone. Images flickered in my mind, her voice on the phone telling me not to bring cheap things, the muffled laughter of her husband in the background, the deed papers stolen years ago. My hands stayed clasped at my waist, steady against the tide of memory. She reached for me then, her fingers soft, manicured, reaching like nothing had passed between us. "We can build this together," she said sweetly, "as a family." I pulled my hand back slowly, my eyes fixed on hers. "Family," I said quietly, "doesn't arrive when the cameras do." Her smile faltered just enough to reveal the crack beneath it. And for the first time in years, I felt no urge to patch it. The receptionist glanced nervously between us as my phone buzzed with another flood of messages, reminding me there were larger stages waiting, and I was the one who would decide what came next. The story traveled faster than I ever could. By the next morning, my phone was a constant vibration of calls from reporters, city officials, and even old acquaintances who had once crossed the street to avoid me. Louisville had found a new subject to whisper about the daughter who shut her mother out, only to come crawling back when the cameras appeared. I read the headlines with a strange detachment. "Pioneer of eco-housing speaks out. scholarship fund to support first-generation architects. The articles praised my vision, but the undercurrent was always the same. Clarice's name was tethered to shame. At charity luncheons, I overheard quiet laughter about her timing, how she had tried to bask in my light only after it was safe. She was no longer introduced as the daughter of a respected attorney's family, but as the woman who failed to see her mother until it was too late. Invitations arrived daily. Boards wanted my perspective. Conferences wanted my voice. Foundations wanted my signature on their programs. I accepted some, declined others, careful not to let recognition swallow me whole. For every speech I gave about housing, there was a morning when I stayed home, pruning the roses I had carried through winter frost. Their resilience comforted me. I never gloated. Not once did I point to Clarice's absence at my side when I stepped onto a stage or received an award. The silence was sharper than any public rebuke could have been. She felt it. I knew because silence leaves space for the mind to fill. And hers would echo with every memory of the words she once used to cut me down. One evening, as I watered the roses in the fading winter light, I realized justice had arrived without the need for shouting. I hadn't needed to punish her. The world had already decided whose story it would carry forward. The petals caught the last of the sun, glowing faintly against the glass. My phone buzzed again, another invitation waiting, and I set the watering can aside, already knowing how I would answer. When the foundation papers were finalized and the press settled into quieter headlines, I decided to mark the moment in my own way. No ballrooms, no chandeliers, no photographers waiting to capture the right angle, just a long table set inside the old warehouse that had become Greenhaven's beating heart. We cleared out the drafting boards and sample models, strung simple lights across the beams, and pushed together every table we could find. My young engineers brought dishes from their family kitchens. Neighbors carried in casseroles and pies. And a few local students I had mentored shyly arrived with store-bought bread. By the time everyone gathered, the room smelled of garlic, cinnamon, and laughter. I sat at the head, not because of title or age, but because they pulled out the chair for me. Looking down the length of the table, I saw faces lit by string lights, eyes bright with possibility. These were the people who had believed not because of my bloodline, but because of the work itself. One of the interns raised a glass of sweet tea. "To Mrs. Mercer," she said, her voice quivering with nerves, "for showing us that dreams don't expire." The toast was awkward, genuine, and it filled me more than any crystal flute ever had. As the evening unfolded, I watched them argue cheerfully about design tweaks, tease each other over burned rolls, share stories of setbacks and stubborn triumphs. My heart swelled in a way I had not felt in years. This was family, not the one bound by birth, but the one bound by belief. When the plates were cleared and only candlelight remained, I leaned back and let the sound of their laughter wash over me. The ache of old rejections quieted, replaced by something gentler, steadier. I looked at them, my chosen family, and for the first time in a long time, my eyes softened with peace. Later that night, when the last dish was washed and the warehouse was silent again, I found myself standing at the window, thinking of the roses waiting for me at home. The night after the dinner, I returned home with a quiet fullness that no banquet could have given me. My small house was still, the only sound the hum of the furnace and the soft tick of the clock above the mantel. On the table sat a bundle of rose cuttings I had taken from the garden my husband once tended with such care. I found my old glass jars, the kind I used to fill with preserves, and rinsed them clean. One by one, I set the cuttings in water, arranging them along the windowsill, where the winter light still reached during the day. My hands moved slowly, reverently, as though planting pieces of memory itself. As I pressed the last stem into place, I whispered to the room, to him, to myself, love may open doors, but only respect keeps them open. The words floated in the air like a vow, gentler than anger, yet firmer than forgiveness. I settled into the chair by the window. The roses lined before me like small sentinels of resilience. Beyond them, the city stretched out, its skyline glowing with new buildings, some already rising from the very blueprints that had once been laughed at in hushed corners of dining rooms. The lights flickered in patterns I knew too well, and I felt a strange comfort knowing the world now lived, in part, on designs that had been born in solitude and stubborn faith. I thought of Clarice, of the cold phone call and the empty chair at Christmas. But the ache no longer cut deep. It was a scar now, and scars no longer bleed. I breathed in the faint scent of roses, letting it steady me. I was enough, always had been, even when my own daughter said otherwise. And as the city lights shimmered against the glass, I knew my life's work was no longer waiting for permission. It was already blooming.